All right, we're live and the sound seems to be running as well. Welcome, guys, to the fourth episode of The Danish Guy. Today we're joined again with Victor. Do you want to
Hi,
say hi?
everybody. Thanks for joining us.
So we have a lot of stuff to get to, so let's just jump right into it. Uh, Usually, like we almost never do any small talk before we get into the things that we want to talk about. But we have a few things like the European lockdown restrictions. There are actually, I don't think a lot of people know this because it's not really being that reported in the news unless you really look for it. But there are massive protests across Europe in terms of the lockdown restrictions and the power that is being given to different governments. And people are getting a little worried because there seems to be an extension of the typical powers that the governments have in during a pandemic. There seems to be an extension of those powers happening in a lot of countries, which we'll get into in just a moment. And I think we also want to talk quickly about the Taiwan-China conflict. How real is it? Is it really a conflict, or is it all just posturing? Like it's been over the last many years. It does seem like it's increasing, like China is pressing to intimidate Taiwan in a time where the Biden administration is in its very beginning, maybe to test things out, to see where the Biden administration stands on the issues. So a lot of exciting things, and if we have time, we'll get around to the GameStop stock revolution as well. Very interesting. But first off, I think we should start with the protests across Europe for all of these lockdown restrictions. For you guys who don't know, in Europe we've had increasing restrictions over the last months, and different countries have different. It's not like all countries are doing the same thing, but different countries are doing different things, and people are beginning to be worried about the powers that the governments are beginning to impose on people, like curfews from 6 in France right now. There's a nationwide curfew from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, so you can't go outside at all. No matter the reason, you have to have like a government approval for leaving your residence after 6 in the evening, and that's nationwide. That's like even far away in a small village in the countryside. So that's pretty dramatic. We talked about last episode. You and I, we talked about how there were a lot of restrictions in Germany as well, and Germany had this policy where they will begin to put people in refugee camps. In refugee camps, if they violate the restrictions and the curfews and everything that's put in place several times, they can be put in refugee camps for not actually violating, as far as I know, any law, but violating like any established law, but these emergency passed powers that the authorities are gaining. So, what have you heard about this? I'm interested to get your take on all of this.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one that caught my attention the most was the riots that there have been in the Netherlands,
Yeah.
where they have been burning cars, and it's for the similar reasons as the one you mentioned in France, where it's people are dissatisfied with the curfews, and it it grabbed my attention particularly because I don't associate the Netherlands with violent rioting. That's not my perception of that as a country. It seems to be a quite peaceful, quite friendly country. If you want to talk about like strikes and France, there's no great surprise there, right? The French are notorious for their ability to strike over. But the Dutch, it getting violent in the Netherlands, and the Dutch being so upset with this really,
Mm.
really caught my attention. And what I began wondering, and I had a conversation with my parents about this the other day as well, is whether or not this is a reflection of the mental health of people. Not so much. I mean, your angle on it is very much people are demonstrating because they think that this is an overstep by the government.
Yeah,
My
that's one side,
initial reaction to it is more people are just sick and tired, and they can't, and especially young people, they can't handle it anymore. They're just sick and tired of this, and they want a little bit of their life back.
Yeah.
And so they're desperate, and because of that, then I would say definitely it's an overreaction. I wouldn't advise anyone to start burning cars, but that's more my initial take, is like, what is happening psychologically in order that people feel that this is a rational step to take, or that this is an appropriate step to take. Because I don't think you go out. I think it's so my take is probably slightly differently than yours. I'm not so at least my initial reaction was not so much about is it right for the government to do this, but more, are we adequately handling the psychological needs of people who maybe live alone and have lived alone, and therefore have been quite isolated for maybe not necessarily during the summer period, but definitely during the spring and during the fall, and now during the winter as well.
Yeah, people have been locked up at this point, isolated, and not been spending time regularly with other people for a long time already, especially in Europe, obviously as well. And in Denmark, the country we live in, the restrictions have just been turned up to now you can only be 5 people in the same, like officially the number is 5. So obviously if you have a family that's bigger than 5, you can be with like your core family members. It's not like you have to, the dad has to leave the family if you're like 4 kids. And so, but I'm going to my nieces and nephews' birthday in the coming weeks, and or at least I plan to, but the restrictions right now is that you can only gather 5 people. So technically we can't do it. So we're thinking about creative solutions of how are you supposed to maneuver around in this time. Like it used to be that you couldn't gather a lot of people, and now it's 5 people, and it seems to be. I just want to do a shout out to Joachim, who says hi. Hey Joachim, what's up? On the channel. It used to, these restrictions, my problem, and I'm trying to give you an overview of why I have the issue that I have, is the restrictions seem to be getting tougher and tougher, obviously, and it's all in the name of combating the sickness that also you said last time that most people can't see. It's not like you're in a war, so there's no physical, there's not bombs going off around you, so you're being restricted a lot. Especially when you think about the fact that most people don't get sick from this worldwide sickness and pandemic. And there's a pattern that the restrictions are tightening. And now it's gotten to a point where not a lot of people can meet anymore. And my worry is how far are the governments willing to go? How much longer are they planning on going? Because right now it's these specific restrictions, and you can't spend time with the people that you're usually spending time with. So people are going crazy. People are. It's not healthy for most people to be isolated. I think there's a lot of introverts who don't mind too much, but it's not healthy for the general population to be isolated for too long. And now we're talking about, is it like half a year? Is it the rest of 2021? No one really knows. And it's a problem for... I talked with my girlfriend the other day, and we talked about, people are often being called conspiracy theorists online in discussions about restrictions and the vaccine and all of these things relating to the pandemic. But I have the view that it's easy for you to be called a conspiracy theorist, or it's easy for you to develop a mindset where you kind of become a conspiracy theorist. Because if you just are like this type of person who wants freedom, and you don't want the government to reach too far into your private life, well, they're doing that now, right? So first of all, they're doing that now. But secondly, you can kind of predict where things are going. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're like, well, the government is gaining power. And now the next step in the beginning, they're going to restrict us. They're going to make sure that we can't protest efficiently. When we protest, which we're seeing in a lot of these European countries, when we protest, they enforce curfews. So all of a sudden, you want to protest the restrictions that are already in place, but you can't do that now effectively because you can't gather more than X amount of people in different countries, and you can't even protest after 6 in some countries. And I'm sure if you're so that do you get what I'm saying? Like that mindset of someone who's already a little paranoid to begin with about the government, it's very easy to understand why some people don't like adding more and more restrictions as you go on.
Yeah, and it's certainly part of like the Western, I mean, the Western philosophy or the Western kind of way of thinking is very much centered around individual and individual rights, right? The right of property, the right of free speech, the right to gathering. So all of these things that have been part of our culture and our for a few hundred years, if not more than that. I can't really name the philosophers, but it's under pressure. There are a couple of things. First, this idea that you mentioned that like there are two things from what you said that I think I'd like to focus on, or that I'd like to like double down on a little bit. One is what you said that most people aren't getting sick, because I don't have the numbers at hand and I don't know that I understand the situation. But I'm also doubtful about whether or not we can actually understand, like, can we appropriately at this time know whether whether all of these precautions that we're taking, whether or not they're being, how much an effect they have on the numbers.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So can you, but let's like, so you could take it to the negative or you could take it to the positive. You could say the infection rate is X. I don't know the number, but it is, let's just call it X. And you could say, well, maybe if it weren't for all of these precautions, it would be much higher.
Yeah.
No, if anyone has done that kind of, has looked at those variations. So it's very difficult to have a conversation and say these restrictions are they're too much, right? They go too far because look at it's so low. Yeah, well, we don't know why X. Do we really know whether X is low? Maybe because of the restrictions. So the first thing is like, how do we actually have an educated discussion about the situation when we don't actually know? At least I don't know. I should speak for myself. When I don't know that we can have all of the answers because we are in it right now.
Yeah,
that's the first thing.
Yeah,
and that kind of leads into this idea of, and which touches on the conspiracy theory idea that you also mentioned, which is whether the government, it's this idea of like, do you trust the government or do you not trust the government, right? And that's almost something that happens before you see the government act, right?
Yeah.
It's not something like you see the government act before, and then you say, oh, they're being nefarious. No, yeah. It's something that happens before.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I think we should be attentive to the government because they have a tendency to overstep their bounds, right? Yeah. That's kind of like where you begin. And then you see how the government acts, and then you say, oh, look, I was right. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas if you start from a position of saying, no, the government is elected by the people, they're meant to protect the people, and then you see all of these precautions, and then you call them precautions, and instead of limitation restrictions, you call them precautions, and then it's all good, right? So it's where you begin, and this whole idea of the conspiracy theories, I don't know. My issue with conspiracy theories is always the same, which is that you assume that everyone, like,
you assume someone has a nefarious meaning behind what they do.
And let's take the most famous or one of the most famous conspiracy theories, right? 9/11, right? You think about how many people would have to be involved to make that plan work. and that huge chain of people that would have to, all of them know a little bit about what's going on, and that none of them, like every single one of them is nefarious and evil-minded, and like that not one of them would kind of break ranks and say, I think this is kind of effed up, right? Like, so the same thing, and it comes back to this idea of, again, what I said previously. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but
No, I get what you're saying.
It comes back
Makes
to the
sense.
idea of, do you believe that people are, do you believe that people are have your best intent in mind, or do you not? And how you personally, what kind of, it's like a glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
depending on where you land on that issue, it determines a lot of other things about how you speak, about how you think. Excuse me. Yeah.
But listen, Europe for a long time has had a very high degree of trust in governments. At least in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, we have a very high degree of trust in our governments. And I think it's being put to the test right now. It's like we're coming to a point where restrictions are being applied that we haven't seen in our lifetimes, and I don't even think that my parents have seen it. And the trust, whether you are, let's say in Scandinavia, you have a high degree of trust in the government, but in other countries in Southern Europe, for good reasons, you have a lower degree of trust in the government. And as we go, it makes sense if you begin to see those countries with lower degrees of trust in the government begin to see them rebel and have protests. But what's worrying me is that we're seeing protests across the Netherlands, France, all of these countries who typically had a high degree of trust, and that tells me that we're heading into territory where we need to be careful of how we handle this, because if people at this point in time during a pandemic, if people are beginning to be skeptical and they're not being explained why things are being implemented, then you can have a much worse situation on your hands than just a few people protesting. Because right now, as you just mentioned, hundreds of people are being arrested in the Netherlands for protesting. And
do you think there's a lack of transparency?
I want to say hi to Dibia. I hope I pronounced it right. There's a few other people writing also. First like for the videos. Saying? Thanks for the like, Dibia. It means a lot. It really helps. By the way, it really helps to push out in the YouTube algorithm. It really helps to push out the video. So thanks a lot for the like. I don't think there's a problem with transparency in some ways, but the problem is that like let's say half the people will always have this idea that the governments needs to be put in check. You need to check your governments. Half of the people in general, I'm generalizing, but half of the people are like suspicious that if we give the governments power, they'll take that power and try to turn it into more power. And that's, to me, that's what the huge protests right now in France are all about. I'm not sure you guys are aware of this, but I did a few videos on it. So let me just briefly explain that France tried to implement this law, this rule that was done by the Macron's party in France, and they tried to implement it. It's called Article 24. I don't have it right here, but basically it makes sure that citizens during the pandemic can no longer videotape and take pictures of the police officers doing their duty in public. So you can it would no longer be legal for you to take pictures or videotape police officers just doing their job in the streets. And they said that they were doing this because they didn't want harm physically or mentally to come to the police. All right, they didn't want that. But the problem here is that you already have laws against that. You can't harass police. You can't physically harm, obviously. You can't physically harm police. You already have laws in place. So the Article 24 are now seeing like tens of thousands of people protesting in France because of that single article. So not only did the government of Macron, not only did they not draw it back, not only did they not like cancel it, they tried to expand the powers of it. Let me just very quickly show you this article from. Let me find it here. This article is from the DW, a German newspaper, and it says that thousands march in fresh protests over new security bill. At least 34,000 protesters took to the streets in France to denounce the bill that's awaiting scrutiny in the Senate. Demonstrators have particularly taken issue with the issue of drones and pedestrian camera recognition. Where France had this issue with the Article 24 that people are protesting, and not only are they not withdrawing the bill, they're trying to expand. So now in the streets of France just a couple of weeks ago, literally you had drones flying around with cameras, not only facial recognition, but body recognition as well. It could recognize you just from the way you walk and the way you behave, put it all into a system. So now you're monitored by drones flying with literal cameras of you to enforce the pandemic rules, restrictions, to make sure that you didn't go outside after 6 in the evening. And if you did, we would know who did it so we could punish them by law. I think that's a dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, it certainly is. But there's a difference between saying one law is unjust and saying all laws are just.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the crux of that's the issue as far as I can tell. Like, I'm not gonna from the information that you've given me, which is I'm gonna give you the benefit of the doubt, and I believe that what you're telling me is entirely legitimate, right?
Yeah.
I don't know much more about it than that.
Everything I say is always true. I never misspoke.
100% true. Yeah. Okay. Well, because I don't. So from what you said, there's no way I'm backing this law, right? Even despite the fact that neither you or I are French, so it doesn't have any, it doesn't affect us. But I agree with you. It's not a good precedent to set. But back to my original point, which would be that despite the fact that this law is unjust and immoral, I think you could call it immoral. That doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that every single I think it ties into something that we've spoken about previously, which is kind of that that you have two positions, right? And you have to be entirely in one or entirely in the other. You can't kind of be a bit of both, right?
Yeah.
So if you're against Article 24, then you also have to be against every single other kind of restriction.
Yeah.
And I think this is simplistic and myopic, if that's using you can say, and it's just like, you and I, we could be arguing some entirely different case, and I might be in favor and say, look, this is a bad argument. I support the cause, but the argument is poor, right? You should be able to kind of break things down a little bit. And I would say, and this is the same thing here, you should be able to break down a position and say, look, I don't think it's problematic that there are certain restrictions. I don't, because the English strain of the coronavirus, or whatever it's called, is the most it's spread with the
contagious,
it's the one
right?
that's spreadest. It's the most contagious. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. So for that reason, I'm okay with the restrictions, let's just say.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I'm in favor of all restrictions.
Yeah.
So I think there has to be a little bit nuance to the conversation. Sorry, that was a long rant just to say I want some more nuance.
It's an elaborate way of saying it.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just like, I need to keep talking or I'll lose the right to speak. And then you just keep piling.
No, I won't take over too much. I'll let you finish.
I was finished. Yeah.
The problem, you say that it's different because France it's not our country and we live in the European Union, so we're neighbors in a way. But to me, it's not that different because France has been fighting in their history for freedoms of the people and all of this. So it really hits people hard. And what I'm noticing during these protests all across Europe is that it's actually what you saw with the BLM is that BLM protests in the States, but also in Europe and different countries. it was mostly young people. With these protests in Europe and especially in France that are protesting the lockdown restrictions, it's primarily people of middle age. It's people between like 30 and 50. You're
Does that
seeing people being in a group, a group of people that are being upset about this, that you're not usually seeing going out and protesting, because usually it's younger people.
does that include the Dutch? Because my understanding was that the restriction or the demonstrations in the Netherlands were mostly young people.
Oh, it might have been, especially the people getting arrested. I read that that was mostly young people.
Okay. I mean, that is interesting that it covers more age groups, because that does mean it is more. It doesn't like it shouldn't be illegitimate if just young people demonstrate, right? That
No,
that shouldn't make a demonstration
no.
delegitimize a demonstration just because it's young people. I
Yeah, I
mean,
agree
if
with
your
that.
people are demonstrating, there should be something about it. But
Yeah,
it still does. It is interesting that it is mobilizing people who, um, yeah, who as you said, generally maybe what's that old cliche, right? You're left leaning when you're young, and you're right leaning when you're as you get older.
yeah, that's what they say.
So if it's if there is a degree of truth to that cliche, then it suggests also that this is a concern that goes across the political divide. It isn't
Mm.
just the people who are protesting aren't just left leaning; they're
Yeah,
also right leaning.
but that's a really good point because it kind of hits those right wing people who want freedoms, but it should hit left wing people who are like in favor of more government, but I don't think they're in favor of government taking away the freedoms of the people and everyone's rights. And the left wing movement is typically about rights and all of this of different groups. But those groups should include just general people, just people in your country. That I think that's a really good point. That the reason that we're seeing this is that it's not a political issue. It is in the sense, but it's not dividing people. It's actually something that everyone kind of gets upset about when you're in your country and you're not allowed to go outside after 6 in the evening, and you see drones flying over your house to make sure that you don't go out, and you know that you're being videotaped if you go out, and they can recognize you with those. I think that's gonna drive most people a little nuts because we were talking about the effects of being in isolation for so long, but now imagine
Yeah.
that now you're being monitored at the same time from the sky. You 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 have to be careful. That's if restrictions keep increasing, then what we're seeing in the Netherlands with hundreds of people being arrested over just, I think, a weekend. I think it was just one weekend,
Yeah, yeah.
and it happened again this weekend. If what we're seeing is just the beginning in terms of when we have these restrictions, as restrictions increase, it makes sense that that's gonna escalate in some way. And I'm never in favor of trying to hyperbolically inflate an issue. I think it's important, especially in these times. But if you're looking at it
Yeah.
very logically, if it's gotten to this point now when people are protesting, and when people are protesting, they're told, no, you can't do that anymore. You have to go inside because now there's a curfew, and if you don't do it, we arrest you. It doesn't
But
make
it's
people's
again,
frustration go away.
no, it definitely doesn't. But I mean, if it's one of those things where it's difficult it's difficult, I think, and you alluded to this previously, it's difficult to separate good intention from evil intention, because in this particular scenario, they both look exactly the same, right? Trying to keep people from protesting can be legitimately defended as being a way of trying to stop the spread of this disease.
Yeah.
But it can also be argued to be no, it's an abuse of power.
Yeah, it can be both.
And there's no way, as far as I can tell, there's no real way of distinguishing which one of the two it is, because they look identical. So again, but I think back to my previous point, a lot of it is about how you initially view government and how you initially view all of these issues. And I echo your sentiment. Like we this is not dystopia. We're still healthy. We're still fairly wealthy in the West.
Yeah.
And we don't know. Like if the vaccines don't work and people get them by the summer, potentially by the end of this year, who knows? Maybe we could be back at something looking like normality. So we also need to be attentive that we don't destroy our society in the process of this pandemic, so that when it at some point when we some point get better, that we're left in a situation. And that can be looked at, you can look at that in two ways, right? Like, we shouldn't destroy our society by passing laws that are unjust, but we also shouldn't destroy our society by inflating this situation to something it's not. Right? If people genuinely come to believe that this situation is being used as a way for the government to become authoritarian, that feeling isn't going to go away in a year from now or 2 years from now.
Yeah.
When the coronavirus has passed. So it's about, I'm so sick and tired of this situation. So it's difficult to say this. I'm tired of being stuck in my house. I'm tired of, I think what people forget, you were talking about how in Denmark you get to see 5 people. I think we neglect the importance of acquaintances, right? Like, we have circles of friends, right? You have the outer edges where, you don't tell them if you're depressed, and you don't tell them, like, when but you go, you hang out with them, you have a beer, you tell funny stories.
Yeah.
They're the people you work with. They're the people at maybe at your club you go to, at school. And and these are the kind of relationships that are being closed down, and you're having to focus on your core friendships. But the acquaintances around the edges, they matter a lot as well. And this is what's being neglected. Anyways, so I'm tired of all of this. And I have to say that because what I want to say, because it's a preface to what I want to say next, is you still have to kind of keep your cool, right? Like, we all have to kind of try to keep our cool as much as we can. And that's why it was important for me to say that I'm really tired of the situation, because I'm not trying to say this as someone who's having a super easy time with all of this. But as much as, it sucks, I think, and as much as Article 24 is problematic, we need to make sure that we don't we don't take drastic measures, no matter which side you fall on the divide, because that is going to haunt our cultures and our societies for years afterwards.
Yeah.
I fear, at least, that'll happen.
It's that like Chinese water torture, where you just get like a small drip of water every time. You heard about it, and you just like, and then at some point you just go crazy from the, like, one drop of water obviously doesn't do anything to you, but it's the same kind of mentality that could be behind this whole lockdown. That if you keep people in a frustrated, isolated situation for a long time, for possibly years, and you keep restricting who they can talk to, and that very important, as you say, outer circle of friends where you're just having fun, like comical relief and all of that. If you get away with that, you have to be careful. You have to understand that there are consequences, for not just economical consequences, for shutting down your country. And we look at a lot of deaths from the coronavirus, and it's horrible. But I think there are a lot of people who have their lives deteriorating when they can't spend time with people. I think you and I are a little more introvert than most people, but so extroverts will have an even harder time. I think you and I will be fine and we'll get by. But imagine being these people that need social interaction every day, or they just go crazy normally. Spend a full weekend alone, and you just feel like, oh, I need to do something. I need to get out. I need to be with people. imagine being someone who's like that, and now you're in a situation where possibly it's going to be another like full year, possibly
Yeah.
because we're in January, and no one knows, no one has a clear view on where this is going. Hey, to Sharab, one of our favorite subscribers or at least mine, because I can't speak for Victor, but one of my favorite subscribers on the channel. How's it going, Sharab? I hope you're doing well. Yeah, he's saying that we're live on a Sunday. Yeah, we're trying this out to make it fit with the everyday life. Like some days just get too busy. Maybe the weekends are better, so we're trying to go live on a Sunday, maybe a Saturday instead of a Friday.
Yeah, we're discussing the situation to see what works best
Yeah.
for for our schedules and also for your guys' schedules. Trying to mesh the two in the best way possible. About I think what I've realized is how much those acquaintances matter. I think even for someone like me, where I don't like, if I'm at a party, I'm in the kitchen, right? Because
Hiding away. Fat enough.
yeah, and for introverts out there, this is a really good trick. You go to the kitchen because people come out there one at a time. They go out there one to grab a beer, and then you can have a conversation like one-on-one for 2-3 minutes, and then they go back to the party, and then the next person comes, and so it's just a series of one-on-one conversations. So I'm always in the kitchen, but even I have realized that those relationships that they're not the people you're going to invite to your wedding. But they're still they still matter a lot.
Yeah, they do.
And you said comic relief. You said it's almost something as basic as like just feeling the body heat of another person, like that gives you something.
The social interaction is super important.
Yeah.
Even for us introverts, like everyone needs it, and we just have to keep a close eye on, like, when we take this away from people, what will it do, like, for everyone? Because we're looking at this pandemic, and it could stretch on throughout the year. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, because as we talked about last time, I think the restrictions are probably going to tighten up. We're probably going to see a new mutation of the coronavirus, and then the governments are probably going to want to lock down people even tighter to really get it under control. And just to bring it back to the whole conspiracy mindset, that's where I get people who are conspiracy minded, because this feeds into their mentality. This, if you look at the situation and you're like, let's say the most extreme, the government's out to get us, Illuminati did 9/11, and that there are penguins on the moon or whatever. I don't know about the last one. Even if you believe all of those, this kind of feeds into your mindset. And the people who are just like right in the middle, not really into conspiracies, but they're not like denying all conspiracies either, it's gonna make them go more. I just think it adds to a mentality that's going to be an anti-government sentiment forming the longer that these restrictions are going on, which is natural. But I think it's dangerous. No, it's not dangerous to have it, but it's dangerous for our countries that it's forming this quickly with all of these protests.
But what do you do, right? Because that's what I get stuck at. Like, what do? You can't inform people more, right? I think because it's on the news every single night. If people are like me, I'm shutting it off. Like, I don't read things about COVID anymore because there's COVID fatigue, right? And I don't think I'm unique in that way. I think a lot of people are just kind of, I can't handle it.
Yeah, anymore. You can't take any more news about it.
So if you can't educate people, if there's a large portion of the population that you can't educate more, there's another large portion of the population, the ones who are conspiracy minded, who don't believe the information that's coming from mainstream sources, let's call it like that, or from the authorities that you're saying.
Yeah.
So you can't educate people more than that. You can't necessarily. It's quite possible that you can't loosen up restrictions either, because of this current mutation of the disease,
Yeah.
of the virus. So what do, right? Because I understand that it's a bit of a negative circle, right? Like you're saying, like the more you close it in, the more people become suspicious. The more they become suspicious, the more you close it in, it leads to a negative place.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to, because you can't all of a sudden say, okay, great, we're having a large portion of the population that is becoming enthralled by these conspiracies or being falling into anti-government kind of sentiment. Okay, so we'll just get rid of our restrictions. Like that's not doable either, right?
Yeah. Shut Up is saying that he's commenting on your earlier statement, where feeling the body hit, Victor. He's wondering what you're thinking of. When you go to parties and you need to feel the body heat of other people.
Yeah, no, I only like one person at a time. Yeah. Body heat of one person at a time. Two.
That's more than enough.
Yeah, that's more than enough. I like listening to loud music in another room, and then I can just kind of. No, seriously,
listen in on other people's conversations.
No, but it works because people, all the extroverts are in there, doing their thing,
and they love it.
And then when they run out of beer, they come into the kitchen, and then they just want to chill for a moment, and then I'm there, and we're chilling, we're talking about life. They're having and then when they get tired of that, they go back to the party, and then someone else comes in. So you're constantly, having eye-to-eye conversation. It's a good trick. It's a good little tip there.
It's a good. I wish I had known about that when I was in college. I guess, what amounts to college.
And it's closer to the food, so win-win.
It's closer to the food. You just snatch it right off the kitchen instead of waiting for the.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I hope that I hope that the restrictions will at worst just remain where they are. That we don't actually see any more restrictions increasing, because I think it's getting to a dangerous level now for people when you begin to see protests in countries where you probably have never heard about protests for the most of your life, and it's happening in a lot of countries across Europe, and they're protesting for different reasons, but it's all related to the restrictions, except maybe in Russia, but Russia is a whole other thing. But by the way, they have the biggest protests, I think, I don't want to say in the world right now, but in what you hear about in the news right now as well.
But it's also like our own country, right? Like you said, you meant like you guys know we live in Denmark, and in our country, politicians, they bike to work, right? Like there's a very close kind of interaction between politicians and us. There's not that big, like I've been to the house of the foreign minister. Like I have a friend who is friend with his kid, and I went to see them, and then there's the foreign secretary having a smoke on the lawn. So there's this very clear, so it's very different than other places. But in our country, now someone has threatened to kill the prime minister. Yeah. Right. So that's maybe normal, and the background was important because that's maybe normal in other places. But here it's kind of a shock. So it's also in our country and where we live that we're seeing people kind of, demonstrate in ways that aren't normal for us, at least. Yeah.
Shut Up is saying. Shut Up is from Thailand, and he's saying, I think he has family, and I don't want to give away too much in case he doesn't want me to tell people. But he's from Thailand, and he says that COVID situation got a bit wild after New Year's, but he's glad to see the situation is under control now, and it seems like there was this spike. Like we don't have to get into it too much, but it seems like there was this spike, which at the very least now, and that's a good argument for these restrictions, if you want to be on that side of the argument, that the spike has been turned down, and I think it's been leveled by like 80% or 70% or something from when it was just the highest, like a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
That makes sense, right? I mean, people around the holidays, people are with family. Typically around New Year's, you maybe drink a little bit more than you're used to. It's not a huge surprise that there'd be a spike.
Yeah. I think I misspoke because he said he's based in Thailand, but he's from Belgium. I think
Okay.
I said it the other way around in a confusing moment. So he lives in Thailand. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think we should jump over to the whole Taiwan China issue.
Yes.
Because that's something I put a little attention on, but I know that you also know a little bit about it and have looked into it. And I think it's a really interesting situation. I know on the channel I have a lot of people. I have some people from Hong Kong who were pretty much since June last year taken over by the CCP government coming in, gaining more and more control in Hong Kong. And now obviously Taiwan is afraid that once China has gained control in Hong Kong, they are setting their eyes on Taiwan as the next country because they see Taiwan as their own state, as their own republic of China. I think it even says on the passports of Taiwan, it says the Republic of China. But they made new passports now because they're trying to be more independent. They made these new passports now where they put the Republic of China inside the passport, so you can't just visibly see it outside. And they made it only in Chinese and not in English. So when they travel, basically, China saw this as a big rebellion, and there's a lot of things happening with the Taiwanese president Tsai as well, who gave a few statements about Taiwanese independence. And then the CCP, the Chinese government, said that independence means war. So now there seems to be a conflict brewing.
I mean, the political situation with Taiwan and the history of the political situation is really interesting. And it wasn't something that I was overly aware of until a year or two when I came across a documentary made by an Australian news bureau. And it's really interesting in the sense that I mean, Taiwan was part of China, right, for like 2 centuries, from like the 17th century until Japanese occupation, if I'm not correct. And then afterwards, during the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek was kicked out by the communists from mainland China, and him and the nationalists escaped to Taiwan. So for a long time, the nationalists in Taiwan considered themselves to be the legitimate party and the legitimate government of all of China.
Yeah.
Well, the communists also said the same thing. We are the legitimate government of all of China. So until like the 90s, from like the late 40s until the 90s, both sides saw each other still as being part of China, right? Taiwan still saw themselves part of the union, part of a union with mainland China, and mainland China still saw themselves as part of a union with Taiwan.
Yeah.
So it's only in the last 20, 30 years that the mindset, as far as I understand, that the mindset in Taiwan has changed from going from being Chinese to being Taiwanese, right? Transforming your identification and how you identified yourself from being Chinese to being, no, I'm Taiwanese and we're different. But Taiwan is not an independent nation.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Like, if you and as you said, if Taiwan were to say we're independent, China would take this would be heavily provoked. The documentary I mentioned, which they have a clip from I believe it's a Chinese general, where he says, if anyone tries to separate Taiwan from China, we'll have no recourse involved militarily. I don't know how old the clip is, but it and it's, if you look at the Olympics, for example, Taiwan participates as Chinese Taipei. Right? They don't participate as Taiwan. They use a different flag. They don't use the nationalist flag, the Taiwanese flag with the sun in the upper left-hand corner. So it's it's really interesting how
I had I made
but
a
it's also quite alarming.
yeah, I made a comment on Reddit because I wanted to do when I was doing my research for the Taiwan China conflict video. I tried to put up in the subreddit for Taiwan, put up like give me inputs on your situation. How do you feel? Someone did a poll and it was like 85% of people said that they felt Taiwanese. It was
Mm.
around 10 people, 10% of the people who said they felt a mix Taiwanese and
Yeah,
Chinese, and only 5% said that they felt Chinese at all.
yeah. But again, it becomes a discussion of what can Taiwan realistically do, right? Because I mean, you talked about this big contract they have with the
Yeah,
U.S., but as far
yeah.
as I'm informed, the defenses that they have currently are fairly outdated.
Oh, I'm
And
sure.
beyond the fact, and then if you look at something as basic as population, right?
Comparison.
There's no comparison. I don't have the exact numbers, but there's no real comparison.
Yeah.
And what makes it also quite complicated is that there's the main island of Taiwan, right? But they have a number of smaller islands that are also part of the country. So the main island of Taiwan is only 160 kilometers from China. But some of these smaller islands are 1 or 2 kilometers. Like you can see them
Yeah.
from the Chinese, like you can look over on the Chinese mainland.
Yeah.
So what do? If China hypothetically were to take these islands, does the main island does the main island of Taiwan then have to respond to these? You're defending strategically. It becomes very difficult because you're defending outposts that are very far from your center of power and your center of strength,
Yeah.
but that could very easily be taken. So how do you? I'm sorry, this is very nitty gritty, but how do you respond, and how do you protect also these places? And
So-
maintain your independence.
Well,
Yeah,
so
I don't know.
how come, why do you think the US has an interest in trying to step in and make these military deals with Taiwan? Like, how come they are choosing a contested, let's say contested nation within very close proximity to the Chinese borders? Because obviously China saw the interference by the Western world into the Hong Kong situation. They saw that as foreign interference because China considers Hong Kong their own part of China, same country but a different system. And Taiwan is kind of the same thing. You can imagine. I keep that question in mind. I just want to say that you can imagine that the U.S. wouldn't react very well if, for some reason, China had a foothold in Hawaii one day, and they began doing arms deals with Hawaii. It would kind of be the same thing
Yeah, well,
in some ways.
okay, but in some ways, yeah, because then we have to get into the history of Hawaii and how Hawaii was annexed, and that's a quite a complicated issue as well, because
Yeah.
some would argue it wasn't entirely legitimate the way that happened. But anyways, that's a side issue.
But why do you think the U.S. is so? Because I think it's a good thing. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But why do you think they're that invested and interested in trying to defend and help Taiwan defend itself?
I don't know. Like, I mean, the U.S. generally gets involved in global affairs, right? They are the global superpower. They have, I think it's like 200 bases around the world, all over. And the crazy thing is that like the next highest country is like 50 or something like that. Like there's no comparison.
Yeah.
And generally, my perspective would be, well, it's economically motivated, right? You invade Iraq. No, okay. Let's say you for example, Iran. Iran had a democratically elected socialist leader that wanted to nationalize oil fields in the, I want to say like 20s and 30s. Maybe it was the 50s or 60s. I can't quite remember. So they had him, toppled and replaced with a more cooperating regime. The same happened in Chile, right? A socialist president by the name of Allende wanted to nationalize the copper mines, and they also had him thrown out of power and placed instead a more cooperating dictator by the name of Pinochet, who is a murderer.
Cooperating
So
being the
a
key
lot
word.
of yeah, so a lot of the motivation, or some of the motivation, is economic, right? And
Yeah.
that's not, and as we've said in previous videos as well, that's not unusual, right? Like our government, we want them to take care of our economic, the Danish government, we want them also to protect the Danish economic well-being of our country. So it's not unusual. So I think the US sometimes kind of varies between saying, no, this is how we maintain our status as a world power. This is how we maintain a global sense of peace. And on the other hand, this kind of more economic minded perspective. I don't know, but
I want to say that Shadab is giving some input because he knows a lot of the affairs of Thailand,
Yeah.
who also recently had some clashes with China, the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea. He's saying that the primary objective of most strategists is to avoid war in the first place, to put so much pressure on your enemy that he never attacks you. South China Sea is the answer to why would the US want to help out Taiwan in this way. And China got more cocky in the statement that all this water in the South China Sea belongs to them. It's not the US who will save Taiwan, he also says. There's a lot of things in that, and I'll let you go in just I'll let you finish in just a moment. But I'm reading a lot of reports about how I think Shadab is spot on this, because I'm reading a lot of reports about how the US is forming military defensive alliances with India and Australia. Very specific. They've had them for some time, but specifically now they're forming them to create these military outposts in the middle of the South China Sea, because I think it's around of a third of all of the trade in the whole world goes through the South China Sea. And obviously China feels like the South China Sea belongs to them, but there's a bunch of other nations in the middle of the South China Sea where they're not willing to give up the territory. So this is an ongoing thing, and especially over the last 4 years with the Trump administration, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of near confrontations, but it's mostly been words exchanged, not really military confrontations. And I think he's saying that that's the answer, and I think that's very accurate. I think the reason the US would want a foothold in Taiwan is to have, if they can get away with having a foothold very close to the border of China and create military defensive alliances with all of these nations surrounding China, then you're beginning to have a stronghold very close to one of your superpower opponents in the world.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of answered what I was going to ask, actually, because I was wondering about the South China Sea exactly. I mentioned the economic, what is the economic upside of these things? And then you kind of answered the question, because I was wondering about the whole situation in the South China Sea with China building artificial islands and this kind of things. And I was wondering what the economic impact was, but you answered it, right? Saying that a huge portion of the world's trade goes through this area.
A massive portion of
effectively by having alliances in the surrounding area, you essentially neutralize the country. At least it's I don't know why I thought of this, but the Cuban Missile Crisis in I want to say the 50s, right? Where the Soviet Union placed missiles on, or were in the process of placing missiles on Cuba. The agreement that that President Kennedy came with the Soviet Union to get rid of the missiles was that the US would remove the missiles they had in Turkey. So the US already had the ability to attack the Soviet Union previously.
Yeah.
And the agreement was, okay, you get rid of your missiles that haven't been built, that you're just in the process of building, and we'll get rid of our missiles that we've already built and we have and we could, bomb Moscow with already.
Yeah.
So it seems to be part of, I guess, the American approach generally is proactively surround. Not proactively, but like before anything happens. That's how I mean proactively.
Yeah.
To surround your enemies, which is what they did in Turkey, right? They had the missiles there. And then the second that the enemy responds, it's like, wait, whoa, you guys are overreacting. Everyone seems to forget, but no. You guys, why are you placing missiles in Cuba? That's, that's not fair. And you seem to forget that, hey, the U.S. already had missiles in Turkey.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were the exact same kind of missiles and if the range was comparable, but, yeah.
Yeah, that's I think it's an interesting thing because I especially a few months ago I tried to focus on the South China Sea, and that's just it's so complicated. There's so many things going on. Let me see what Shadab is saying here. It's not the U.S. who will save Taiwan. We just read that before, but it has to come from this SEA region. The Philippines is also seriously fed up with China water grab, and that's what I remember reading a lot about. That a lot of these countries are getting on the side or making deals with, because India and Australia obviously already have these huge trade deals with China because they're right next to them, or Australia is, a bit south, but they have these huge trade deals with them already because they're in the same region. And now that the U.S. under Trump and the previous few administrations, they were trying to create these alliances with all of these countries. And I caught myself thinking, because I'm from the West, so I have a tendency to think, the U.S. does some horrible things, especially in the Middle East. But hopefully, in general, they do things for reasons where they stand to profit, but reasons that overall help out with conflicts and the world in general. I had this view of, but then when you begin to look at it from the other side, if you take the glasses on of some nation in like China, like if you're China, then your main opponent is beginning to make trade deals and military deals, defensive deals with nations surrounding you and all around you, not just one nation, but several nations, and they're all your neighbor. You can kind of understand why China would feel a little on edge about them doing that. The SEA region is the Southeast Asia region.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting if you find a map that looks at claims on the South China Sea. You see that it's China, it's Vietnam, it's the Philippines, it's Indonesia, it's Malaysia. And all of their claims overlap. So it's quite it makes it a very complex situation.
I think the way China sees it right now is that, like, I think it was up to 90% of the South China Sea. They put this, I think it's called the 9-dash line, where they basically, without international law, just put like lines in the water and said that amount of water is ours. And it's like it covers 90% of the South China Sea, and it invades waters next to the Philippines, to Thailand, different countries.
But that's why they've been so concerned with building these artificial islands, right? Because if you have land territories, because the international law states that there's a certain distance from your, I don't know the specifics of it, but it is that a certain distance from your coastline you have rights, and then a little bit further than that you have kind of economic rights and things like that. But so it's all about the land, right? If you have land, then that extends your claims on the ocean area surrounding it. So obviously that's why they're building these artificial islands. So you see pictures of excavators in the middle of the ocean. There's just this little piece of land, and there's an excavator just there, and it looks so bizarre.
Yeah. We're
But it
claiming
is,
this for China.
yeah. But you mentioned Australia. I mean, the problem with, I think Australia is also in a situation where they're having a hard time, where it's difficult for them to navigate. I imagine it's difficult for them to navigate their foreign policy as well, because they have a long history of alliances with the U.S. and their cultural similarities. They're both former British colonies. The U.S. the Australians fought in World War II, alongside Americans quite a lot. But at the same time, the bulk or the backbone of Australian economy is mining. It's resources, right? It's minerals. It's all of these. And most of these materials, most of these, they go to China. Right?
Yeah.
China is their main economic partner, as far as I'm aware, or at least it's one of their main economic partners. And if China doesn't buy, like one of the reasons that Australia was able to be fairly unaffected by the crash, by the economic downturn in 2008, is because they have all of these natural resources that they export and that they sell.
Yeah.
But if China doesn't, at least that's how I understand it, they were fairly unaffected by it. I don't know if,
China signed this huge, the world's biggest trade deal recently, the RCEP, and it involves, I think it was up to 14 countries. It's almost exclusively, I think it's exclusively, I just want to say almost, if that's one country, in the Southeast Asia region. It's 14 countries. They all signed this huge deal, and basically it nullifies the tariffs of these countries, a lot of countries in the Southeast Asia. And it's an attempt, in my view, it's an attempt to take over the trade lines of a lot of these trade deals that were signed over the last 10 years between the US and India and Thailand, Taiwan, the Philippines, so on and so on. Australia as well, New Zealand. I think, in my view, it's an attempt to nullify all of those trade deals. So China will, in my view, take over a lot of the trade that was intended to go to the US, because now you no longer have tariffs, and China is giving up the tariffs for them to have a bigger part of the trades that are coming out of those countries. It's gonna hit Europe, but it's going to hit the US specifically very hard in terms of economic trade with Southeast Asia. China will take over a lot of it.
I just did a quick research. Part of the reason also Australia survived the crisis in 2008 is they had very little debt, and they had a huge, I think, quite a huge surplus of, they had a healthy budget, so they were able to help the economy. But I think in part of that is part of their all of their natural resources. Yeah, I think I keep thinking about what you said previously about China's perspective. How would you feel if your biggest rival is making allies with everyone around you, and the same leeway that we kind of give the US of saying, well, we understand, well, we maybe don't approve of what's being done, but we understand why a government of a country does what it can to protect the economic interests of that country, right?
Yeah.
We're not shocked by that. That's how most governments operate. And so you can think what they're doing is wrong. You can think, the way you're protecting your economic interests is underhanded. But it's not different than what anyone else would do. But it doesn't seem like we're giving China that leeway.
No,
it's like when China tries to protect its economic interests, it's like, ooh, wow, China's trying to take over the world. That's the headline.
Yeah.
When that's but again, it comes back to this idea, or like you were saying, about this Western perspective on the US. And it's about, you have to ask yourself, well, if there is only one, it's not about saying we want a perfect superpower that protects the world, but it's about saying, to a certain extent, saying, well, what is actually the best
Yeah, the
superpower?
better one of the two or three.
The better one of the two.
Yeah.
And I'm not, again, like my bias, because I'm a Westerner, is pro US, right? Like I
Yeah.
listen to American music every single day. I watch American TV shows every single day. We're speaking in English. I was educated by Americans. So we obviously, I would suspect that we have a quite pro-US bias. But there's also a lot of other things involved, right? Like you think about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs in, the political system, right? They're they're kind of authoritarian system, and all of these things make you wonder, is it really in the best interest? Is it not? Are we not correct in being skeptical?
Yeah.
I wonder about China's continued. I don't know how to say this in a way that's not going to get me in trouble.
No, you can say what you want, and don't worry about the. I found an interesting guy on YouTube the other day. He's from the US, but he lives in China, and so he basically take up all of the prejudices, multiple prejudice that you have, and he takes them up and he confronts them as someone who lives in China, someone who sees the everyday life in China. And because they do a lot of good things, and they're getting rid. I heard an argument recently that they're getting rid of a lot of the poverty in China. And then someone else from China told me, yeah, but they were part of creating that in the first place by taking money out of the hands of regular people and focusing it into construction and infrastructure and all of this. So it's really what I'm trying to say is that it's really difficult as a Westerner to get a good insight into what's actually going on, because what we hear in the news is covered from the perspective of the West. So when we hear about the Uyghur camps, these millions of Muslims possibly living in China, and a lot of them are being kept in these camps. When we hear about that, it sounds horrible, and it most likely is horrible. But it's so difficult when you know that there are two superpowers basically fighting it out over media, over news media.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to know what are you being fed and what's actual information.
Well, that's a much broader concern, right? And not everyone, but most of the people I know, acquaintances or otherwise, there is this concern with the media, right? And we've talked about it a number of times, right? Can you trust mainstream media? And there's a lot of people who just say nope, like categorically no. If it comes from the mainstream media, it's
go with the opposite,
right? Yeah, exactly. And I'm skeptical of that position again, because I don't understand always why is it in everyone's best interest to lie? I don't think it always is.
Yeah, why would it be?
Yeah, why is it economically? How are mainstream media getting economic profit out of telling you a ton of lies? Some conspiracy theorist somewhere would probably tell me why, but anyways.
There are good reasons,
so
but it's difficult. I am not sure you can assume that it's always nefarious. But on the other side, I just like if the best option would be if you could speak Chinese and if you could speak English, because then you would get from both sides, because you kind of understand what this is all about. You understand what a war in the media looks like when you've just had a president for 4 years where one side of the media would support him, the other side would be very much against him. You could read the same story. One story would be him going, I think this was him going to China. The President Trump went to China, and he won. The favorable side was reporting how he did this and this. The negative side, CNN and all this, was reporting how he got 3 scoops of ice cream instead of all the regular people who got 1 scoop of ice cream. and then you understand, okay, so this is what's happening to me. It's not Trump anymore. This is the world stage, and we're being told by one side, we're being told by the Western media one narrative. But if you could understand Chinese, and if you spoke to people who understands Chinese, they would give you a complete other version of the truth.
Speaking of Trump, we were talking about Trump last week, and we were talking about the number of people who voted for him, and I made a wildly incorrect calculation. We were talking about how half of people had voted. So I'm like, 320 people, give or take, in the U.S., 50%. Oh, so 160 voted for Trump, and I completely ignored the fact that children don't vote, and not everyone votes. So the more correct number is, at least in 2016, it was 62 million, and in 2020, it was 71 million. Still a ton of people, but I just wanted to quickly make that correction.
Still a ton of people, yeah.
Yeah, and it's still, it still speaks to a quite divided nation anyways, but...
It's Shadab is saying, just to on this superpower issue, he's saying that you don't want to have a single superpower. You want to have like 3 to keep things more balanced. And I definitely don't want one superpower. I don't want the US, and I definitely don't want China to be the overwhelming superpower either.
But I don't know. I mean, we've had one superpower for 30 years, right? Since the fall of the Soviet Union in, was that like 91, 90, 92, something around that.
I'm not sure, but around that time.
Okay. Yeah, so it's in those years. I can't give you the exact year, but I think we can agree that it's in that kind of that frame, that period. That means for 30 years we've had one superpower, which means for all of my life and for basically all of your life as well, we've only had one superpower.
Yeah.
As long as I've been my entire adult life and my entire conscious life, there's only been one superpower. And I try to imagine, and I can't entirely, but I try to imagine the world before, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when you had effectively 2 superpowers, right? You had Russia and you had the US. I don't necessarily think the world was a much greater place, was it, right? Because you had people in East Germany that had that they were repressed and they were under surveillance constantly. You had, I mean, if you look at all of the crimes of the Soviet Union, like, it's crazy. Like I think it's millions and millions. It's over tens of millions of people that were killed by the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So the Bolshevik Revolution was in 1918, I want to say. So that give or take, 70 years. That's, at one point sorry, I'm trying to pull out all the historical facts that I know, but so in the Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union, is kind of the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and most of the wheat came from there. And so, but there was a group of Ukrainian farmers whose name I don't remember. The name of that kind of group I don't remember. They were much more successful at growing wheat. So the central government basically had them all killed because they assumed that they were doing something corrupt and we keep using this word, nefarious. They were somehow doing something evil to get more power, to make themselves unequal. What happens then is you kill all of the people who were really, really good at farming. The only people who are left are people who don't know how to farm well. And so you had an enormous hungersnød. Help me, son. I'm stuck. Famine. Sorry, people. The word missed me. So you had a huge. So. What's my point? My point is not that. My point is, it's not always better to have 2 superpowers if one of those superpowers is corrupt, murderous, and dictatorial.
Yeah. Like,
I would much rather have one superpower where I know there are certain things we can be fairly confident about the US, right? Like looking maybe past, what's happening in Guantanamo Bay. Generally, there's freedoms, there's rule of law. It's not dictatorial. You don't have these same kind of injustices. So it is obviously better to have more, in the same way that it's better to have a lot of not to have a monopoly in economics, to have companies competing. Yeah.
That's a good point.
I agree, it's better. But if one of the companies, but I'd rather have one halfway decent superpower than 3 or 4 where the other ones are corrupt and murderous and I can't think of other words to describe them, but I think you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I get it. And I think, as Shadab is saying, that more superpowers is better as long as you kind of get everyone to agree on the same rules. Because I don't want to be someone from the West who tells everyone to be exactly like like us. I don't want everyone else to rule the same way, and I don't need them to. But I would like, ideally, we would live in a world, and it will always be come short of what you really hope for, like a pure democracy.
Yeah.
It'll always come short. But now that we live in this world where you accept that people are always gonna be flawed, I would rather live in a world where we have a bunch of superpowers and they kind of sign an agreement and they stick to those. Like that there must be some kind of reason for them to stick to those agreements, like human rights and all of these things. I don't have an issue with, I don't want the US to be, I like, I know I'm waddling around a little bit. I like the role in some ways that the US has when it comes to keeping control of a superpower like China. In some ways, I like that. But at the same time, no one keeps an eye on the US when it comes to these endless wars in the Middle East. So you're always going to have a flawed ruling government. But as you say, it's better that you have one that in general tries to promote the freedoms and the rights that you believe in. And I don't mind that we would have like an EU superpower, that we have like a Brazil, like as Shadab is saying, all of these different ones, like the US, EU, Brazil, China, Russia, India. India, which by the way is growing like exponentially fast as well.
Yeah, India's on the way.
I don't want to get to this point where we have like one superpower. And because the problem is that once you get to a point where you have one superpower, it's so easy for someone to gain control of that system, for them to begin, like the US is beginning now, politicians working with corporations, getting money from them, and now they're beginning to pass laws that are very favorable to certain corporations. That would happen inevitably if you had like one world superpower. I think it's much better you spread it out. You have a bunch of different ones.
I mean, if we're talking utopias, I would much prefer that every tree had a. This is total utopia, but if we're up to, since we're talking sort of about utopias, I think you should make like a limit that a nation cannot be more than like 15, 20 million people. Like that's the max. Also because when you have a country of 1 billion people, the distance between the leader and the ruled is enormous, right?
Yeah.
But like for us, where we are, we see our politicians cycling on the street. We can actually, they're still humans because they're still fairly close to me. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
But when your leader is one person and you're in a nation of 300 million like the US or 1 billion like India or China, the leader almost becomes godlike because they're they're 1 in 1 billion. It's very different to be 1 in 1 billion than to be 1 in 1 million. Right?
Yeah. this one leader
So
thing, it just, to me, it just seems like such a weird, outdated thing that we still do, that we still hang on to. Like, we still want, like, that alpha chimp on the throne. We still want someone who represents that everything's going to be okay, everything's under control, don't worry, guys. It's such a weird thing. Like, we still have, in a democracy like in the West, we still have, different politicians. They represent typically different parties, and then you don't really have that chimp who's on the throne controlling everything. But so many countries, like, we have a queen still, but we have a bunch of politicians. But I just find, I
yeah,
don't want to get rid of the monarchy, especially in Denmark. I think we have the second longest running monarchy in the world. But I just find it so funny that we still have this idea of having that one person sit on the throne ruling people, instead of having, like, almost a pure democracy like they have in Switzerland. You vote on almost everything.
yeah.
I just find it such
And
a funny thing.
just about the queen thing. I think actually it's the oldest. What I heard is it's
Ah,
the oldest continuous monarchy. So, claim to fame here, you know.
go Denmark.
But also, yeah, go Denmark. You gotta represent. But speaking, I was thinking of Switzerland exactly as you were right before you got to them. But also, for example, the Swiss president. I believe that they have a kind of a council of seven, something like that. Maybe it's more. And then whoever is president of the country basically just shifts. So
Yeah,
these seven people are voted in, and then they each have like a turn of being leader. So they don't really have, even taking what your point was about direct democracy. They vote on a lot more issues than we do. Regarding the leadership thing, they really have a much more fluid understanding of leadership than we do.
yeah,
But I think it boils down to, you have two systems, right? Generally speaking, you have kind of dictatorship and king, the one man in charge, or woman in charge. And then you have a democracy, which is, supposedly the people in charge. And I know that technically you have a lot of in between things, right? You have oligarchy and a group of people ruling. But generally, what we see in the world is one of those two, right? You either have one person in charge or a lot of people in charge, and
yeah,
each system has its weaknesses, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
for sure.
generally, democracies are less corrupt
Hmm.
because you have more eyes on the money, you
Yeah,
have more eyes on the power,
yeah,
but they are also much less efficient, right?
yeah,
And vice versa. The kingdoms or the dictatorships, they're more corrupt, fewer eyes on the money. The guy in charge, he can do whatever he wants,
yeah.
but they're often much more effective because it just takes one guy saying that needs to happen for it to happen.
Like Biden right
And
now in
so
the
it
US.
I'm not, okay, I'm not going to
He's not
comment
gonna
on that.
jump on the boat. I'm just gonna
I'm not
reset my
gonna
camera. I think the camera is out of.
yeah.
Voila.
And so it's an imperfect world, it's an imperfect system, but I think I had a teacher who used to say, or he'd say once, sometimes being in the is a good thing, being slow is a good thing, because it ensures that you look at all the sides of the
Yeah,
issue.
yeah. It doesn't
um,
change too radically.
yeah, you kind of make sure you at the end of the day stay in the middle somewhere, right? And by staying in the middle, you actually do the will of the people, because
Yeah,
the people are generally mostly in the middle.
yeah,
At least that's my perception. But so I think I think obviously the weakness of the one man in charge as well is that, it can work really well if the person you have in charge is decent and noble and has the will of the people in at heart. Then it can be wildly successful. You look at but generally those kinds of people are rare, and and mostly the people who get in charge are not like that. They're not constructed in that way.
This is a bit controversial, but I would say that ideally a dictatorship would be the best form of ruling over people, because it would like if you have a good king and you live in a country,
Yeah.
and he genuinely takes care of your interest, the people's interest, before his own and before politicians and so on, almost nothing can stop that nation from thriving and the people from thriving. And you'll give up some freedoms, but at the end of the day, if you're prospering, your family has endless opportunities and so on, most people would probably give up some of these, like this idea of having all of these freedoms that we have in democracy only really came about because we had a fear of the people ruling over us. But if you have a really good king and people are satisfied with the king, that seems to me like to be the best style of leadership, of ruling, having a ruling class over you. And obviously people are flawed. So to me, I wouldn't want to live in a place where people would just write down laws, like the king would write down laws and you would have to obey. I wouldn't want to live in that place, but
Yeah.
ideally it would be the best style in my view.
But that answers your question, doesn't it? Why do people hold on to this desire for one, or why do we as a race, to say something extraordinarily general and maybe too general, but why we hold on to this kind of idea of the one man in power or one person in power? I think it's because of what you say, because we all long for, or we all hope for, that's maybe a better way of saying it, we all hope for a good king or a good queen, right?
Yeah.
Because but at the end of the day, as you said yourself, right? I think history has shown that generally the good kings, they're rare, right?
Yeah.
And it almost seems that, like, I think of like Danish history and things like that, that inevitably, if you had a good king, it was almost like the next king after him just always terrible, like inept, either just like sadistic or just totally inept. I don't think we've ever had it's maybe happened once in a while, but mostly it was like one good king, four bad kings, one good king, four bad kings, right?
And
And so
it's so weird it's like that, because typically if you're a king, you get a son and then he's supposed to rule, or you get a daughter and then that's the queen. And you would think that they would kind of take on the ruler style of their dad, but as you say, they just go in the complete opposite. And Shadab is saying that it's too much utopia. You're never going to have 5 decent kings in a row. And as you just said.
Yeah, and that's why in the West we've come to settle on democracy as the preferred system of government. Here, let me just find Churchill's quote. You know the Churchill quote about democracy?
I don't remember it, but as you look it up, I want you to, after you found the quote and tell us about it, then I want you to tell me to kind of circle back on where we started with these European lockdowns. I want you to tell me, like, what do you think is the next step that's going to happen? Like your best verdict on the next
My
step.
best guess.
Your best guess, yeah. On where
Okay,
we're going
I
next.
don't know if this quote might not actually be him. Like, there are a number of quotes that people say it's Churchill and it's not. But the quote is, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others." Right?
Yeah, that's a really good quote.
Yeah, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
It's
Man,
really
you put
well
me
said.
on the spot.
Yeah. So because we're seeing restrictions, and I'd like your take on, like, what do you think is going to happen next? Basically, you have a couple of options. Are we going to the governments are going to slow down their control on people, or is it going to increase? And if, then what's going to happen?
So I'm answering this question well knowing that there's no chance I'm going to get it right.
That's a pretty good
that's
chance.
the way with predictions. There's zero chance I'm going to get it right. But you give it a go anyways.
All right.
it's like trying to predict football matches or the NBA draft.
Football,
you
you
know,
always get wrong. Always get
yeah,
wrong. Yeah.
or what player is going to get drafted in what spot. You know, you maybe get one or two right, but there's no way you're going to get all 50 right.
Yeah.
I suspect that currently in Denmark we have we're in a form of lockdown until the end of February. I would expect that that'll be extended by at least another month till the end of March. And then as maybe mid-April, oh, please no, but maybe mid-April. And then as the weather slowly gets better, until that happens, people are going to lose their freaking minds. But around April, as you know, more, you know, hopefully around mid-April, maybe a lot of the healthcare service, a lot of the healthcare workers will have gotten their shots by then.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think by mid-April they'll start slowly opening up.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll do like last year, that the summer will be fairly open, you know, and then as we go into the fall, there'll come some restrictions in place as well again.
Yeah.
And then
that sounds likely.
And then maybe by next February, we might be all clear. That's my guess.
That would be really good, and that would cause, at least if you could see it all kind of fading away, it would cause everyone to have a release for the isolation and all of this. I think it would help people a lot if they could. People need some kind of sense that we're fighting this together, and kind of a clear voice on where exactly are we, what are the most likely outcomes, even if they're bad. Just be honest with people, just let them know, because at the end of the day, you don't want to keep people in the dark, and especially you don't want to put curfews on people when they protest, especially when they protest the government, like they're doing in France and the Netherlands and other places that we've been talking about. I think this is a good place to round it off.
It's also yeah.
But I'll let you finish.
Well, yeah,
but before you do, I just want to say thank you to the people watching, and thank you to Shut Up for being a faithful subscriber to the channel. It really means a lot. So thank you so much, and for your input in the conversation. This is a lot of the reason that we do these live streams, is to me and Victor have a conversation about relevant issues, but also talk with you guys. So I'm really happy that you Shut Up and a few other people are taking up the challenge to ask us questions and talk with us as we address all of these things.
Yeah, I think the what I'd like to end off with is just the question of how do you best deal with dissent, right? Or how do you best deal with a mob? Because sometimes a mob needs to be
dealt with.
Sometimes they need to be given freedom, and sometimes they need to put it down. And in this situation, I really don't know how to best deal with people who are very, very angry. I don't know what the best way to deal with it, because maybe they're angry for a reason, and maybe they're just angry because I'm sorry to maybe simplify it too much, but maybe they're just angry because they're tired and exhausted. But I'd like to second your what you said. It's it's really cool. I mean, I'm amazed that that we can have this conversation and it's watched maybe potentially all around the world, and hopefully we get more people watching and get more comments from all over. And it's so cool that we do get comments from you guys, because we don't live in Thailand, right? We don't know what's going on. And we're talking about, we don't get the news from China, so we only get it from a certain perspective. So the more we can, so it's super cool when you guys come with your comments and give us something else to think about. So thank you for watching.
Yeah, I just on a side note to that, I had because I was getting a lot of the side of the Western media on different issues. Putting it out in my videos, obviously, because I talk about what I read in the news and what I find interesting. And then I started this Chinese girl, because I did a few videos on China and how they take over more and more. And this Chinese lady, she began writing me on my personal email to the email linked to the YouTube account. And she began, so we had a dialogue, and I agreed that I would take a look at the articles that she would send me from Chinese newspapers, written in English, so I could understand them. And it gives you a different perspective, but at the same time, you have no idea if the sources are good, if the sources are straight from the government propaganda, or it's so difficult to tell. But I think what you and I like to do is to keep an open mind and be pretty fair in our look at things from both sides, as well as you can, because you always have your tendencies and the way that you see things, which is fair. On a note to end, Shadab is saying that the answer to lockdowns is that you just need to end it. And he's talking about how he's had like 50% cheaper beer is the answer to the lockdowns. And then he's yeah, I don't know if I should read the last few comments. But Victor, it was really great of you to join. Thanks for talking about these issues. Again, it's always great to spend time with you, have your mind on all of these issues, and just have a conversation about it along with these people. So thank you for joining,
sure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to you guys for watching along. It's been fun, and we'll be back next weekend. So make sure to put an